Chicago, 1930. The city was drowning in prohibition money, booze, guns, and bodies on the pavement. And in the middle of it all stood a man with a boy's face and a killer's heart. His name was Lester Joseph Gillis. The world knew him as Babyface Nelson. He wasn't the biggest or the smartest, but no outlaw of his time spilled more blood. From the back alleys of Chicago to the final gunfight in Barrington, his life was a storm of rage, loyalty, and bullets. This is the true story of the most violent outlaw of the Depression era, the man the FBI called Public Enemy Number 1. If you enjoy our videos, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts about today's topic in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Let's begin. It started on the north side of Chicago, December 6, 1908. The city was rough around the edges, smoke from the stockyards, factory whistles in the cold air, and a new generation of immigrants trying to carve out a life. Among them were the Gillises, a hard-working Flemish-Belgian family. And their son, Lester Joseph Gillis, would grow up to be known by another name entirely, Babyface Nelson. Before the newspapers, before the gunfights, he was just a restless kid in a crowded neighborhood. Neighbors said he had quick hands and a short temper, a boy who wanted to be seen even when it got him in trouble. He'd roam the streets, hanging around older boys who knew how to steal a car or fence a watch. On the 4th of July, 1921, the first real crack appeared. Lester was 12 when he found a pistol, one of those cheap handguns that floated through the city back then. Playing with it in the alley, he pulled the trigger. The bullet hit a playmate in the jaw. The boy lived. But the system took notice. Police called it accidental. The court called it delinquent. Lester was sent away over a year in a state reformatory. For most kids, that was punishment. For him, it was education. Inside those walls, he learned how the underworld worked, how to lie, how to fight, and how to keep your mouth shut. By the time he came out, the streets didn't look like home anymore. They looked like opportunity. The boy who once shot a friend by mistake was now something else entirely. He'd learned that a gun gave him power. And in Chicago during the Prohibition years, power was the fastest way to get noticed. This was the beginning of Lester Gillis's story, a quiet spark in a restless city, a spark that before long would set half the Midwest on fire. By the late 1920s, Chicago was living under the hum of prohibition. Liquor was outlawed, but the city flowed with it, poured from the basements of hotels, hidden behind gas stations, and carried through the back streets by men with more nerve than sense. Lester Gillis was one of them. He was 20 now, small and wiry, working at a neighborhood Standard Oil station on Chicago's west side. To most, it looked like an honest job. But to those who knew the streets, that gas station was a front, a hangout for a crew of young thieves who called themselves the Strippers. They specialized in stealing tires and stripping cars down to the frame before dawn. It was there that Lester found his first real crew. He wasn't the biggest or the oldest, but he had drive and a mean streak that made up for his size. The older thieves noticed it. Before long, he wasn't changing oil anymore. He was running bootleg whiskey through the suburbs in borrowed trucks, learning how to make a living on the wrong side of the law. Chicago was divided then. Capone's empire downtown, the North Side mob fighting for its share, and in the middle, the smaller gangs trying to stay alive. Lester's world overlapped with one of those outfits, the Toohey Gang, a tough, street-smart group out of the northwest suburbs. Roger Toohey ran the operation, gambling, bootlegging, hijacking. Men who knew how to shoot and how to disappear. It was through those connections that Gillis learned the rhythms of organized crime, how to run loads, move product, and trust no one. Somewhere in that blur of stolen cars and backroom deals, he met a local girl, Helen Wozniak. She wasn't from the underworld. She was a factory worker's daughter, steady, loyal, and tough in her own right. Against the odds, she fell for him. And in 1928, they married. They rented a small place and tried to build something that resembled a life. But the street always had a way of calling him back. The gas station, the bootlegging runs, the taste of quick money. It all pulled harder than the promise of peace. By the end of the decade, Lester Gillis had a wife, a child on the way, and one foot planted firmly in Chicago's criminal underground. He wasn't yet the man they'd call Babyface Nelson, but the path was set, and there was no turning back. By 1930, the rules of the street had changed. Bootlegging was still king, but the real money was moving faster in armored cars, in bank vaults, and in the homes of Chicago's rich. Lester Gillis had been running small jobs for years, but now he wanted more. He fell in with a crew that shared the same hunger, a handful of stick-up men who hit homes instead of warehouses. They were methodical, clean, and fast. Their first big score came on January 6, 1930. They broke into the North Shore home of Charles M. Richter, a magazine executive with a taste for fine jewelry. The gang taped him up, cut the phone lines, and ransacked the house. They walked away with $205,000 in jewels, nearly $4 million in today's money. 2 months later, they struck again, robbing the bungalow of Lottie Brenner von Bülow on Sheridan Road. Another $50,000 in diamonds, gone without a trace. The papers were quick to give them a name, the Tape Bandits. With every job, Gillis grew bolder. He learned to move fast, to talk soft, and to use violence as punctuation. Never hesitation, always control. But control only lasts so long in that line of work. On April 21st, 1930, he robbed his first bank. $4,000 from a small-town branch, a dry run for what was coming a month later. Another jewelry haul, $25,000 in stones. And then, the job that would mark him for life. October 3rd, Itasca State Bank. He and his crew stormed the place, guns out, masks on, and made off with $4,600. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the exposure. A teller later identified him, and that same week, he robbed the wife of Chicago's mayor, Big Bill Thompson. She described her attacker in chilling detail. He had a baby face, he was good-looking, hardly more than a boy, dark hair, grey top coat, brown hat. And with that, Lester Gillis became Babyface Nelson. 3 weeks later, he proved the nickname didn't fit the man. During a failed roadhouse robbery in Summit, Illinois, 3 people were killed and 3 more wounded. Days later, in a tavern holdup on Waukegan Road, Nelson shot and killed a stockbroker named Edwin R. Thompson, his first known murder. By the end of that year, the Tape Bandits were no longer a clever headline. They were a priority target. Nelson's face, young and unassuming, was becoming one of the most dangerous in Chicago. He had the speed, the nerve, and now the blood on his hands. The boy from the reformatory had crossed the line, and there was no walking back. By the winter of 1931, the run was over. The Tape Bandits had made too much noise, too many witnesses, too many bodies left cooling on the floor. Chicago police swept the city, rounding up every small-time stick-up man who fit the profile. Among those caught was a man they called George Babyface Nelson. He was 22 when he stood before the judge. 1 year to life, the sentence read. Joliet State Penitentiary. A place built to break men, and often it did. But not Nelson. Inside, he watched, listened, and learned. Joliet was full of bank robbers, enforcers, and getaway drivers, men who'd built their names in the prohibition rackets. For Nelson, it was a criminal finishing school. He spent his time planning, not repenting. And in February 1932, he made his move. During a routine prison transfer, he slipped away, details lost to time, but the outcome clear. Lester Gillis vanished into the Midwest winter. With help from old connections in the Toohey gang, he headed west, crossing state lines until he reached Reno, Nevada. Reno was a gambler's town, wide open and corrupt. There, Nelson found shelter with William Graham, a crime boss who ran bootlegging, gambling, and anything else that paid. For a while, Nelson lived under the name Jimmy Johnson. It was in Reno that he began to build a new network, quieter, meaner, and more professional than the Chicago boys he'd left behind. He drifted to the Bay Area working for Joe Parente, a bootlegger with connections along the coast. And through Parente, Nelson met two men who would become crucial in the next act of his life: John Paul Chase and Fatso Negri, both gunmen, both loyal, both as reckless as he was. In late 1932, while back in Reno, Nelson met a visiting bank robber from the Midwest, Alvin Karpis, already a rising name in the underworld. Karpis introduced him to Eddie Bentz, another career outlaw with a steady hand and a cool head. That meeting would change everything. Bentz had experience, Nelson had ambition. Together they would take what Nelson had learned in Chicago, speed, violence, control, and apply it to something bigger. By the summer of 1933, he was back in the Midwest. The small-time tire thief from a Chicago gas station was now running with national names, and the country was about to learn what babyface really meant when the shooting started. By the summer of 1933, Lester Gillis had stopped taking orders. He'd learned enough from every crew he'd ever run with: how to case a target, how to plan an escape, how to keep men loyal. Now he was ready to build something of his own. His first big test came that August in Grand Haven, Michigan. The job was a bank, clean, simple, and fast. He teamed up with Eddie Bentz, the veteran robber he'd met through Alvin Karpis. They pulled the heist, but the take was smaller than expected. Still, it proved one thing: Nelson could organize, lead, and get men out alive. That confidence was worth more than the cash. 2 months later, he struck again, the First National Bank of Brainerd, Minnesota. This time, the team was his own. He recruited 3 hard cases: Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. Each one brought experience, muscle, and nerve. Together, they stole $32,000, about $750,000 in today's money. Witnesses remembered the scene: Nelson firing a submachine gun into the streets, spraying bullets at anyone who dared to move. It was reckless, but it sent a message: he wasn't afraid of the noise. With the money counted and split, Nelson drove south, picking up his wife Helen and their 4-year-old son Ronald. The gang regrouped in San Antonio, Texas. They weren't hiding, they were shopping. In the underworld, everyone knew the name Hyman Lehman, a gunsmith who specialized in custom jobs for men who didn't ask for receipts. Nelson bought several weapons from him, including one that would later make history: a Colt .38 Super, modified to fire fully automatic. It would be the same gun that killed FBI agent W. Carter Baum at Little Bohemia. But in December 1933, things in San Antonio turned bloody. Local police had been tipped off about northern gangsters hiding in town. When detectives cornered Tommy Carroll on the street, he opened fire, killing Detective H.C. Perrin and wounding another officer. The rest of the gang scattered. Nelson and Helen fled west again, back to the Bay Area. There, he reconnected with old partners, John Paul Chase and Fatso Negri. Together, they planned a new wave of robberies that would stretch from California to the Midwest. The country was deep in the Depression. Banks were hated, money was tight, and armed robbers like Nelson became folk villains to some, nightmares to others. But for Nelson, it wasn't about politics or survival. It was about control, the rush, the gunfire, the certainty that he could outthink and outshoot anyone chasing him. By the year's end, he wasn't just another name in a police file. He was building a legend. And soon, that legend would collide with one of the biggest outlaws in America, John Dillinger. In early 1934, the criminal world revolved around one man, John Dillinger. Bank robber, escape artist, national headline. And somewhere in the shadows, Lester Gillis was waiting for his chance to step up beside him. On March 3rd, Dillinger made his famous break from the Crown Point Jail in Indiana, the so-called wooden pistol escape. The newspapers called it a miracle, the FBI called it a scandal. But on the street, everyone whispered the same thing. Somebody helped him. That somebody was Nelson's crew. Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, all men tied to Nelson, were said to have arranged and financed the escape. The deal was simple. Dillinger would repay them after the first big job. When Dillinger reached the Twin Cities, Nelson and his right-hand man John Paul Chase were there to meet him. But the reunion turned bloody almost immediately. A local paint salesman, Theodore Kidder, accidentally cut them off in traffic. Nelson lost his temper, pulled his gun and shot the man dead in the street. It was a warning. This wasn't the careful, calculating Dillinger crew of the past. Nelson brought chaos wherever he went. 2 days later, they robbed the Security National Bank in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The take was around $49,000, a fortune during the Depression. During the escape, Nelson sprayed the street with his submachine gun, wounding motorcycle officer Hale Keith. Witnesses said he fired like he was enjoying it. A week later, on March 13th, they hit another target, the First National Bank of Mason City, Iowa. Dillinger and John Hamilton were both shot and wounded, but the gang still walked away with $52,000. By then, the press had given them a name, the Second Dillinger Gang. No leader, they said, just outlaws orbiting each other, drawn by greed and speed. The FBI closed in quickly. In April, agent teams ambushed Eddie Green in St. Paul, shooting him dead even though he was unarmed. The gang scattered again. Nelson and Chase headed west to Reno, looking for safety in familiar places. But safety didn't last long. In Reno, two old crime bosses, Bill Graham and Jim McKay, were facing a federal mail fraud trial. The chief witness against them was a man named Roy Fritsch. Nelson, ever the loyal gunman, decided to take care of the problem. On March 22, 1934, he and Chase abducted Fritsch, killed him and dumped what was left down an abandoned mine shaft. The body was never found. By spring, Nelson had crossed a line even most gangsters wouldn't. He wasn't just robbing banks, he was killing witnesses. And though the public still saw him as Dillinger's sidekick, the FBI knew better. They'd begun to understand that the smiling, boyish face in the photos was a mask. Behind it was something far more dangerous, a man who enjoyed the violence. By April of 1934, John Dillinger's gang was running out of safe ground. Every hideout had been burned, every ally questioned. The crew needed somewhere quiet, off the grid, and out of reach. They found it deep in the northwoods of Wisconsin at a rustic lodge called Little Bohemia, just outside Manitowish waters. The owner, Emil Wanatka, welcomed them as paying guests. He had no idea that the polite man renting his cabins was public enemy number one. By Friday, April 20th, the gang had settled in. Dillinger, Van Meter, Carol, Hamilton, Nelson, and their girlfriends, including Helen Gillis. For 2 days, they drank, played cards, and listened to the radio, believing they'd found a moment of calm. But calm never lasts. Wanatka's wife, uneasy about her guests, told a friend what she'd seen: men with guns, speaking in code, acting nervous. The message reached the FBI in Chicago on April 22nd. Special Agent Melvin Purvis and a hastily assembled squad of federal agents flew north to surround the lodge. They didn't call for local backup. They didn't wait for daylight. They went in fast, believing they could end it in one night. What followed was one of the worst blunders in Bureau history. As the agents approached, a car was leaving the driveway, 3 local men who had stopped in for Wanatka's cheap Sunday dinner. They couldn't hear the agents' shouted orders over their car radio. The agents opened fire, killing one man instantly and wounding the others. Inside, the gunshots set off panic. Dillinger and his men grabbed their weapons and fled out the back door, disappearing into the woods. Nelson, who'd been in a nearby cabin, did what he always did. He went toward the fight. He fired first, exchanging shots with Purvis himself, then ducked back under a storm of bullets. When the gunfire thinned, Nelson slipped into the forest, moving in the opposite direction from the others. He made his way to a nearby farmhouse where he took a couple, the Langs, hostage and forced them to drive. Dissatisfied with their slow car, he stopped again at a nearby house belonging to Alvin Kerner, the local telephone operator. Nelson barged in, taking the Kerner family captive. Moments later, another car pulled into the driveway. FBI agents W. Carter Baum, Jay Newman, and local constable Carl Christensen. Nelson asked who they were. When they answered, he opened fire with his automatic pistol. Baum was hit 3 times in the neck and died instantly. Christensen and Newman went down wounded. Nelson stole the Bureau's car and sped off into the woods, but the car blew a tire on the dirt road, forcing him to abandon it. He hid for days with a Chippewa family before slipping away for good. By the time the smoke cleared at Little Bohemia, the FBI had 2 civilians dead, 4 more wounded, and not a single outlaw in custody. Newspapers savaged Melvin Purvis and director J. Edgar Hoover. Congress demanded answers. Hoover's reputation, once untouchable, was suddenly under fire. But one man came out stronger than before, Babyface Nelson. He had faced the Bureau head-on, killed a federal agent, and lived to tell it. In a single night, he'd gone from sidekick to headline. The country now knew his name, and the FBI knew they had a new #1 problem. After the disaster at Little Bohemia, the country knew his name. Babyface Nelson, the smiling killer who'd gunned down an FBI agent and vanished into the woods. In the weeks that followed, every newspaper in America ran his picture. 5'4", dark hair, boyish grin. But behind that face was the most dangerous man in the Midwest. The Bureau was desperate to save face after the botched raid. Hoover needed a victory. So they shifted the story. Instead of focusing on the FBI's mistakes, they focused on Nelson, the mad dog killer, the outlaw who shot first and smiled later. For the first time, he was being hunted as an individual, not as Dillinger's sidekick. Meanwhile, the gang was falling apart. Just a day after the Little Bohemia raid, Dillinger, Hamilton, and Van Meter blasted through a police roadblock near Hastings, Minnesota. A stray bullet struck John Hamilton in the back. He lingered for days before dying in hiding at the end of April. Dillinger buried him himself. 2 months later, on June 7th, Tommy Carroll was cornered by police in Waterloo, Iowa. He opened fire, but this time the lawmen shot back. When the smoke cleared, Carroll was dead. His girlfriend Jean Crompton, who'd once shared a cell with Helen Gillis, lived long enough to identify him. By then, Nelson and Helen were ghosts in the Chicago area. They moved from tourist cabins to roadside camps, meeting relatives only at night. Every contact risked a raid, every safe house another ambush waiting to happen. Still, Nelson refused to hide for long. On June 30th, 1934, he rejoined Dillinger and Van Meter for one more job, the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. The crew went in armed to the teeth. Outside, Officer Howard Wagner was directing traffic when he saw the robbery in progress. He drew his pistol but never got the chance to fire. Van Meter's shot hit him square in the chest. The scene turned into a war zone. Nelson traded gunfire with a local jeweler who tried to intervene, bullets shattering glass up and down the block. The robbers escaped with $28,000, dragging hostages as human shields. When the shooting stopped, several bystanders were wounded, and South Bend would never forget the sound of that day. By mid-July, Dillinger was dead, ambushed by Purvis and his men outside the Biograph Theater in Chicago. For Hoover, it was redemption. For Nelson, it was an opening. When Pretty Boy Floyd was killed that October, the Bureau needed a new headline. Hoover stepped to the podium and made it official. Lester Joseph Gillis, alias Babyface Nelson, is now public enemy #1. By then, Nelson was one of the last men standing from the Dillinger crew. Van Meter was gunned down by police in St. Paul that August. Eddie Green and Tommy Carroll were already gone. Nelson kept moving. Reno, Las Vegas, Sacramento, changing cars, faces, and names. He stayed armed, restless, always with Helen and his loyal partner John Paul Chase. He'd killed more agents than any other outlaw in FBI history. To the Bureau, he was the ultimate prize. To the underworld, he was a ghost. And by the fall of 1934, that ghost was drifting back towards Chicago, where his story would end in a storm of bullets. By the fall of 1934, the country was closing in on Babyface Nelson. Every road west of Chicago had his name on it. Every police bulletin carried his face. The FBI had made him the most wanted man in America, and he knew what that meant. There'd be no arrest, no trial, no surrender. So he kept moving. After the bloodshed in Indiana, Nelson fled west with his wife Helen and his last true ally, John Paul Chase. They drove through Nevada, down through California, living in auto camps and rundown motels, the kind of places where nobody asked questions if you paid cash and kept the engine warm. The Great Depression had filled those camps with drifters, men without jobs, women with children. all chasing the next meal. In that sea of desperation, Nelson blended in. He wasn't the headline killer there, he was just another man sleeping under a tarp with his family. They spent October holed up at Wally's Hot Springs outside Genoa, Nevada, a quiet spa surrounded by empty hills. Nelson was sick, restless, and paranoid. He cleaned his guns every night, convinced the FBI was one step behind. Helen tried to keep him calm, but she could see it. The violence was eating him alive. By November, the trio drifted north again, cutting through Reno and Sacramento, then back toward the Midwest. Chase drove most of the way while Nelson scanned every mirror for the glint of a tail light. Back in Chicago, Hoover's bureau was tightening its circle. Agents were tracing phone calls, interviewing anyone who'd ever shared a drink with Nelson. One name kept coming up, the Lake Como Inn in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, a known hangout for outlaws and bootleggers. The Bureau put it under quiet surveillance, betting Nelson would return to familiar ground. They were right. On November 27th, Nelson, Helen, and Chase pulled into the inn, looking for a place to spend the night. But inside, waiting in the shadows, were federal agents. The meeting was brief, a glance, a flash of recognition, then panic. Nelson hit the gas before the agents could draw their guns. The black Ford roared out of the parking lot and onto the highway, disappearing into the cold grey light. Within hours, the radio wires lit up. Agents were ordered to converge on every road between Lake Geneva and Chicago. They didn't know it yet, but the chase had already begun, and before the day was over, babyface Nelson would make his last stand on a stretch of asphalt outside a small Illinois town called Barrington. Morning came cold over northern Illinois, November 27th, 1934. The air had that steel-grey quiet that always comes before trouble. Lester Gillis, babyface Nelson, was back on home ground, riding south toward Chicago in a stolen Ford. He had his wife Helen beside him and his partner John Paul Chase in the back seat. The car carried everything they owned, guns, cash, and a man's last ounce of luck. Up ahead, on US Highway 12 near Fox River Grove, two FBI agents, Thomas McDade and William Ryan, were driving north. Each man knew the face they were looking for. Each man knew Nelson's reputation: short, quick, violent. When their cars passed each other, recognition hit both sides at once. Nelson's head turned, Ryan hit the brakes. Both vehicles swung around in the road, tires screaming, engines roaring. For several miles, the chase snaked down the highway, the Ford's V8 engine outrunning the Bureau sedan. From the passenger seat, Chase leaned out and opened fire with a Thompson submachine gun. Bullets tore through the agent's windshield. Ryan and McDade returned fire, one shot piercing the Ford's radiator. Steam hissed from under Nelson's hood and his car began to falter. Moments later, another Bureau car joined the hunt. A Hudson driven by Special Agent Herman Ed Hollis, with Inspector Samuel P. Cowley riding shotgun. They had been part of the team that killed Dillinger outside the Biograph Theatre that summer. Now they were after the man who had replaced him as public enemy number one. Nelson's crippled Ford veered off the highway into the entrance of Barrington's North Side Park. The Hudson overshot him by 100 feet and skidded to a stop at an angle. Both agents jumped out, using their car for cover. Helen Gillis scrambled from the Ford, running for a ditch as Nelson and Chase stepped into the open. Then came the sound that would echo through Bureau history. A 2-minute gun battle that sounded like a war. Nelson was hit first. A .45 slug tore through his abdomen. He stumbled, traded weapons with Chase, and pushed forward. Cowley's machine gun jammed. Hollis raised his shotgun and fired buckshot into Nelson's legs. Nelson went down, bleeding, then rose again, advancing on the agents with grim determination. He fired point blank. Hollis went down with a bullet through the head. Cowley was hit in the chest and stomach, collapsing beside the Hudson. When it was over, the park was silent except for the hiss of Nelson's dying car. Barely able to stand, Nelson told Chase to grab the Bureau's Hudson. Together, they loaded the Ford's guns into it, helped Helen inside, and sped off toward Chicago. Blood poured from Nelson's wounds. 9 bullets had hit him in total. They made it to a rented house in Wilmette, just north of the city. By the time they carried him to bed, his breathing was shallow, his voice faint. Helen knelt beside him, holding his hand as he whispered, I'm done for. At 7:35 that evening, Lester Joseph Gillis, Babyface Nelson, died. He was 25 years old. When the FBI found his body the next morning, wrapped in a blanket in a roadside ditch near Skokie, the manhunt ended the only way it ever could. Hollis and Cowley were both dead. The Bureau had its revenge, but at a cost that shook it to its core. In death, Nelson's legend hardened into something larger than the man himself, a small, violent figure who had outshot the law until his last breath. He'd gone down firing, exactly as everyone expected he would. The morning after the gunfire faded in Barrington, a telephone lineman working near Skokie saw something in a ditch beside St. Paul's Lutheran Cemetery, a blanket patterned with Indian designs wrapped around a man's body. When police arrived, they pulled back the fabric and found him. The boyish face was still recognizable, the same one from the wanted posters, Babyface Nelson. He had been shot 9 times, his clothes soaked through with dried blood. The woman who wrapped him there was gone, but she had left a mark of care that didn't fit the headlines. Later, Helen Gillis told the FBI he always hated being cold. It didn't take long for the Bureau to find her. The newspapers said Hoover had issued a death order. Find the woman and give her no quarter. Whether he said those exact words or not, the hunt was ruthless. For days, Helen wandered through Chicago's back streets, tired, grieving, and carrying the weight of 2 lives, her husband's and her own. On Thanksgiving Day, she surrendered. Helen Gillis, once the loyal wife at Nelson's side, was charged with harboring a fugitive. She served a year and a day in a federal women's prison outside Detroit. John Paul Chase didn't get off as lightly. He was captured soon after, convicted for his part in the Barrington Shootout, and sent to the new federal prison on Alcatraz Island, a rock built for men like him, where the sound of the sea replaced the sound of sirens. As for Nelson, the man who had turned a boyish grin into a national nightmare, he was laid to rest beside his wife's family in St. Joseph Cemetery in River Grove, Illinois. The stone is simple. 2 names side by side, Lester Joseph Gillis, 1908 to 1934, Helen Gillis, 1908 to 1987. The ground there is quiet, the kind of quiet he never found in life, but his legend never stayed buried. In the years that followed, the movies turned his story into myth. The baby-faced gunman, the trigger-happy outlaw who stood toe-to-toe with the FBI, what the films rarely showed was the truth. A man whose violence was constant, whose temper ruled him, and whose love for power outweighed his fear of death. Lester Gillis was many things: husband, father, thief, killer. But in the eyes of the Bureau, he was something else entirely. The most violent outlaw of the Depression era. A man who killed more federal agents than any criminal before or since. He wasn't the biggest name of his time, not the richest, not the smartest. But when he went down in Barrington, he made sure the world remembered him. And nearly a century later, it still does.